Guilty. It's a heavy word. To those who have been assigned that word by a jury of their peers, its weight is a constant burden to carry. For those wrongfully branded with that word, its weight is amplified by injustice. Angela Garcia is well acquainted with the weight of injustice and the wrongful assignment of judgment by a jury of her peers. Angela sat behind bars for 22 years accused of setting a fire in her home for financial gain, a fire that took the lives of her 2 little girls, a fire that ultimately took the better part of Angela's life too when it confined her behind bars for over 2 decades. Angela was convicted for an arson that never happened. The evidence upon which the prosecution built their case was nothing more than some old wives' tales that sauntered into court disguised as science. And once Angela finally had a team of people fighting to right the wrongs that had been done to her, the prosecution offered her a deal that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Some legal professionals refer to it as a dark plea. Plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit and earn your freedom. The alternative was to relive the horror and trauma of another trial. After 2 hung juries before her eventual conviction, this would have set Angela's life in the hands of another 12 strangers after 3 different juries of her peers had failed her. For Angela Garcia, mustering that much faith in a system that had doled out such heartache, trauma, and injustice was just too big of a gamble. So Angela accepted the dark plea, the proverbial poison apple, eager to just put all of this behind her. But that's the problem with the dark plea. There is no putting it behind you. It sticks to you like a shadow that is immune to the sunlight of truth. To receive a guarantee of freedom, Angela Garcia had to plead guilty and tell the world that she accepted responsibility for the deaths of her 2 precious children. And Angela Garcia accepted this condition because she had learned that despite the old saying, the truth will not always set you free. This is Angela Garcia's story on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark, sooty landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I am the cosmic meat potato, drifting between realms, basking in the glow of celestial flames. But today I'm here on this podcast to speak of mortal arsonists and their feeble grasp of fire's true power.
If you have not checked out the Orno series on the podcast You Should Be Here, please do check it out. All the proceeds from that Podcasters Give Back collaboration will go directly to a charity standing up against domestic violence and human trafficking, and it is completely free to you. You only have to listen. I contributed 2 episodes to that series. Both are cases of domestic violence. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts by searching for You Should Be Here, or go to the link in our show notes. And if you'd be so kind as to leave a 5-star review and rating, that will help get more listeners so they can raise more money for victims of domestic violence, because everyone deserves a safe love. Speaking of 5-star ratings and reviews, leave one for us too. Those ratings and reviews are super important to help us grow. Podcasting is not free, and we are not asking for financial support, just for your help growing our audience. The best way to do that is to leave a 5-star rating, write a review, comment on our episodes in Podbean or Spotify. And as always, I invite you to also help us in our efforts to grow by following us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and or X. I post regular updates to cases and work very hard to provide regular content that is both informative and interesting. So when you see content from us, please consider sharing it in your stories, leaving a comment, giving us a like. Those comments, shares, and likes are especially helpful. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and comment and like on content there too as well. And as always, feel free to send us your fire stories, feedback, case suggestions, etc. to crimetoburn@gmail.com. Thank you to those of you that did reach out this week. I even got a couple case suggestions. I'm very grateful for those, and I'm looking into them. And to all of you that have been so incredibly kind to interact with our content and leave us ratings and reviews, we thank you very much. Also, you can feel free to purchase some Crime to Burn merch on Spreadshop. We have some really nice designs, including one that says, "The truth will stand while the world burns," and one that says, "If you literally light up the room, we're going to talk smack about you on Crime to Burn, and your mom too." And there's other designs, but we've also reduced our profits to just a few bucks per item because we're hoping that you'll be able to find something in your price range that you'll love. There's everything from tank tops to hoodies and hats and tote bags and stickers and magnets, so go check it out. The link is in the show notes.
You should add something that they can't afford that they'll hate.
Maybe you will find something that you hate and can't afford. I don't know.
I just want it to be balanced.
So today we're starting another wrongful conviction case. And I do want to offer up a trigger warning that this case does involve the deaths of 2 children, so if that's not something you can handle hearing, we understand and we'll catch you on the next case. You are not excused. You're the co-host.
I was going to leave.
But even with the exceptionally difficult parts of this case, it's so important to share in order to shine a light into some of the darker shadows of our criminal justice system. And Angela Garcia isn't the only person that has been failed completely by the system. I have included some links in the show notes for how you can get involved to help formerly incarcerated people like Angela. Now, this case was actually a request from Christine Bunch. We covered Christine's case several episodes back. She was the Indiana mom accused of setting a fatal house fire that took the life of her toddler son. We covered her case in a 2-part series, and then we got the opportunity to interview her. And this was one of the cases that she specifically asked us to cover, and I understand why she sent it to us. It's such an incredibly important case to understand, and to understand many of the ways that our justice system's processes can be problematic, to put it lightly. So let's get into it. In November of 1999, Angela Garcia was a 22-year-old woman engaged to be married. She was a mother of 2 small children, both girls. Naima was 3 and Nija was 2. Both girls were upstairs in Angela's bedroom watching TV, while Angela was downstairs talking to her mom and sister on the phone about the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. Candles were burning in Angela's dining room, her babies were upstairs watching TV, and Angela was a woman with plans. She wanted to better her life for her girls. She wanted to be a paramedic, and she had recently visited a Navy recruiter and had considered joining the Navy. But the recruiter informed her that yes, she could absolutely join the Navy and they would pay for her schooling, but there was just one problem. She couldn't get accepted and go into basic training while she had custody of 2 small children. So Angie had gone to her sister and asked her sister if she would take guardianship of the girls temporarily so she could join the Navy and get through basic training. This would ensure that Angie was able to have health care for her girls, steady pay, and it would provide Angie the education she wanted without her having to incur debt. As a 22-year-old single mom, Angela knew what it was like to struggle financially, and her sister agreed without hesitation. Their family unit was a team, and they intended to stand by each other and help each other out with whatever was needed. But ultimately, Angela decided not to join the Navy. The home Angela lived in was actually owned by her mother and stepfather in a neighborhood that was described in some articles as being economically depressed. Angela had in the past expressed disdain for her neighbors that were thought to be engaged in illegal activities, and this didn't make her the most popular resident at the neighborhood block party. She was reported to have referred to them as, quote, crackheads, unquote. Reportedly, several of her neighbors just didn't like Angela because of her disdain for their position and life choices. After hanging up the phone with her mom, Angie went upstairs to use the restroom, and when she exited the bathroom, she was shocked to find thick, black smoke rolling up the stairs and rapidly filling her home. The smoke was choking her and obscuring her vision. She was coughing, and in a panic, she went into her room looking for her 2 daughters that had been in there watching TV the last she knew, but she couldn't find them. She recalls blindly feeling across the bed and around the bed for their tiny bodies, but she just couldn't find them, and the smoke was growing thicker and choking her, and she realized she needed help. She needed to get help before she passed out from smoke trying to rescue her babies. So she made the decision in her panic to break out the window of her bedroom, climb out onto the porch roof, and jump down. Once she did that, she ran screaming for help to pound on a neighbor's door. And once she had the neighbor's attention, she ran back to the house with her neighbor so they could try to get in to get her babies. And that's when she realized her keys were still inside the house and all her doors were locked. In desperation, she thinks she kicked out the front window, but her recall of exactly what happened and the order it happened in is disjointed and confused. She says in interviews that trying to remember what happened and the order it happened in is like trying to recall a dream after waking up. She remembers pieces, and trying to piece them together in order leaves a very imperfect story, one that the police eventually picked apart. She thinks she tried to re-enter the house, but the smoke was too thick and the flames were too intense, and she just couldn't get to her babies. Angela was frantic and hysterical. The fire department arrived, and Angela was transported by her sister to the hospital, where she was informed by medical staff that her daughters had not survived the fire. Her babies were gone, and Angela was absolutely in shock. Meanwhile, back at the house, fire investigators began the task of trying to determine the cause of the fire. They did bring in an arson dog. The arson's dog name was Pyra, which I think is a cute name.
Oh, but it was the bestest little thing.
Yeah. Anyway, Pyra was trained to alert to accelerants, and the dog did not indicate, meaning that it was unlikely that an accelerant had been used. Note that false positives with an arson dog are a lot more common than a false negative. It's not impossible for a dog to fail to report when there actually is an accelerant, but it's also not likely. The fire department initially deemed the fire accidental, and just 2 days later, the house was completely razed, completely destroying any remaining evidence along with it. No materials had been taken or retained to test for accelerants. In the days following the fire, Angela submitted the insurance paperwork for her renter's policy, and that's where the concern began. The insurance adjuster reported to police that she was overvaluing her property's contents. Now, before we all go judging this, you only have to open Facebook Marketplace to see examples of people having a falsely skewed idea of what their belongings are worth. I've seen ads like, "We bought this leather sofa 10 years ago for $5,000 and we'll let it go for $4,500.
That sounds like a good deal. What do you think?
Stop. However, it turns out that the renter's insurance and Angela's life insurance policy had just been purchased in October, a month before the fire. And her life insurance policy included 2 $5,000 riders, one for each of her children. Even more alarming, the fire occurred the day after those insurance riders for her children kicked in. It seems police hadn't been aware of the timing of the insurance policy purchase until they became aware she was overvaluing some of the contents of her home, and then it started to feel like suspicious timing. According to one article, she had indicated in her insurance claim that her stove was new, bought the year before the fire. The crime scene photos told a much different story, showing a very old stove, possibly from the 60s. Insurance adjusters were unable to verify with store records that Angela had actually purchased some of the household appliances and pieces of furniture that she claimed to have purchased in the recent years. And this made investigators suspicious that Angela was committing insurance fraud. When they determined that Angela had also taken out life insurance policies on her 2 children, they suddenly were not so sure this fire had been accidental. Now, this information may start to make you feel a little conflicted. Angela had asked her sister to take custody of her kids. Then she had bought a renter's policy soon before the fire. Then she decides not to join the Navy, keep the kids, and her house burns down, killing her children, and she happens to have a life insurance policy that pays out on them that went into effect the day before the fire. I will confess that I had some of the same experiences of suspicion at this point. Some of the allegations made me question if Angela might actually be guilty. But as I worked through the trial information and the interviews of Angela and the defense's case, and I compared it with all of the actual scientific evidence or lack thereof, I became convinced of Angela's innocence. So it's okay if you're getting those conflicted feelings, but I'm going to let you sit with them because this is what the jury had to sit with before the defense could do their job to defend Angela, and I want you to feel how stacked against her the deck actually was. Neighbors of Angela told investigators that she was hysterical on scene the night of the fire. But was it just an act, some sort of Oscar-worthy performance by a woman that had killed her children for money? And then there was the phone records. Remember that Angela had been on the phone with her mother and sister, and her phone records confirmed this. There was a single phone in the house downstairs, a landline. This was in 1999, so everyone didn't have cell phones. In addition, Angela had an ADT alarm system in her house. At 7:20 p.m., Angela's phone call with her mom and sister ended, and the first 911 call was received 15 minutes later. But at 7:30, just 10 minutes after Garcia had hung up with her mother, the ADT system reported a tamper code from the alarm panel. ADT called the house at 7:33, and someone picked up the phone. The line was open but silent for 12 full seconds before the call was disconnected. If Angela's story that she had been upstairs in the bathroom and then climbed out a second-story window was true, who had been downstairs at that time to answer the only phone in the house at 7:33 p.m.? When ADT tried to call back, the line was busy. Police felt like they had a pretty good reason to look closer at this fire. We have a suspiciously answered phone call that messes up the victim's timeline. We have recently purchased renter's insurance and riders for the life insurance policies. And now Angela is being accused of inflating her insurance claim. I can understand how police were suspicious, but without evidence that this was arson, there's just not a crime. So police made it arson. They interpreted the evidence in a new manner to support this theory. Now, initially, fire investigators had surmised that one of the candles Angela had lit in the dining room had fallen over and started the fire. But as they re-examined the photos from the house, they came to completely different conclusions. In photos taken after the fire, investigators noted that the floor in the dining room had been burned through. In addition, they noted that the holder that the candles were sitting on was a really big, sturdy metal candle, the kind that had a spike on it to hold the candle on. They felt that it was too big and sturdy to have easily toppled over to drop a candle onto combustibles, and there were no combustibles near the candles. Suspicious of her insurance claim and her life insurance payouts for her daughters, investigators made the decision to change the cause of the fire from accidental to arson, claiming that the burned-through hole in the dining room had to indicate that this was the point of origin, and because fire burns up, in order for the floor to get hot enough to burn all the way through at this location, somebody must have poured an accelerant onto the floor, which would have supposedly caused the fire to burn through the floor. Now we know this is bunk. Fires do burn downward. They burn downward more slowly than they burn upward, but you do not have to have an accelerant pool on the floor to end up with a hole in the floor. This has been completely debunked as an old wives' tale by laboratory testing. However, at one point all fire investigators were taught to presume holes in the floor were proof of an accelerant. But that wasn't the only problem with their interpretation of the evidence. We already discussed that they didn't collect samples from the dining room to rule out the presence of an accelerant, but we do know that a dog did not indicate the presence of an accelerant. In addition, the area of the most fire damage is not always the area of origin. This is another old wives' tale that was taught to fire investigators as gospel for far too long. What affects the intensity of a fire in a particular location within a compartment is not so much the fuel load as it is the ventilation available for the fire.
You said load.
If you have a wood stove, you may understand this, because if you open the draft all the way, your fire is going to burn much hotter and more intensely than if you choke it back. The amount of air available to the fire determines the fire's intensity. So the areas of most damage are often the result of the fire reaching an area with optimal airflow and not necessarily the result of the fire burning there for longer. In fact, one study that was done to determine if arson investigators could successfully determine the area of origin in a compartment fire was set in a compartment with a door open. In every single case, no matter where they set the fire in the compartment, the area directly across from the door had the most damage, and in almost all cases, the fire investigators identified that as having to be the point of origin. So neither of these are proof that this was arson based on actual scientific and laboratory testing, but the fire investigators decided that because they were convinced this had to be arson, they were willing to interpret the evidence however they needed to in order to charge Angela. And let's talk about this candle holder for a minute. The type of candle holder they're describing is the kind that would hold a pillar type of candle and not a taper type of candle. And I've personally experienced where the wick is off-center just a little bit in these pillar candles, and instead of melting the candle down through the center, you can end up with a hole in one side of the candle in which the wax is able to drip out. Now, when you burn a candle, most people don't realize this, you're not burning the wick, you're burning the wax that melts and is drawn up the wick by capillary action. So this means that if you pour a puddle of molten candle wax onto a surface and you light it without a wick, it will ignite that melted wax and give you a pool fire. Guess what investigators are looking for when they look for signs of an accelerant? They're looking for irregularly shaped burn patterns with clear lines of demarcation around the edges, because this indicates that there was a liquid there in a pool. Well, guess what else investigators said that they saw in these photos? Patterns showing clear lines of demarcation of a pool fire, and yet none of them considered that it could have been from a candle that collapsed on one side, spilling wax onto the surface below. Y'all never leave a candle burning unattended in a room even for a few minutes. Not the kind in the little glass bowls, not the kind in the thick pillars, not the kind that are put on your birthday cakes, not anything. Just don't leave candles unattended, not even for a minute. Also, they decided that there was evidence in these photos of alligatoring, and we've talked about alligatoring in a few episodes. Alligatoring is a char pattern that is very common in wood surfaces after a fire. In alligatoring, the wood forms blisters with cracks in between, and they are called alligatoring because they resemble alligator skin.
Also, if you do like a workout in the morning and your underwear gets up in your butt crack, that's also called alligatoring.
I did not know that, but thank you for enlightening us with that fact. Once upon a time, investigators were taught that when the blisters in alligatoring patterns were large with rounded tops, it meant that the fire grew very rapidly in intensity and it was likely the result of an accelerant. However, this has been debunked by laboratory testing. Char patterns can be used to tell investigators which way a fire may have moved through a compartment, but they absolutely are not indicative of the presence of an accelerant. And NFPA 921, which is the standard for fire investigation methods, specifically warns against using alligatoring and claiming it's evidence of an accelerant. And by the way, NFPA 921 was released in 1992, 7 years before the fire at Angela Garcia's home. And there is another thing that you need to know. We've discussed in several cases how the justice system is biased against people on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. And while Angela herself wasn't by any stretch rich, in fact, she was considering joining the Navy just to be able to provide for her girls, Angela's stepfather was a business owner and a very successful one. How successful? He drove a Rolls Royce. He owned the house that Angela was living in as a renter. Her mother reportedly showed up to court one day wearing a mink coat, and the press absolutely shredded her for it. You see, the justice system is biased against people that can't afford a private attorney, but in the court of public opinion, they saw a family that had all the finer things in life, and they heard Angela was being accused of insurance fraud, and the public was serving up a tasty meal of gossip that the family was clearly money hungry and willing to do anything to get more of it, even commit murder. Now, Angela had grown up comfortably and had expressed disdain for some of the neighbors in her community over their illegal drug-related activities, so she just didn't fit in. She was actually a Puerto Rican woman, but she appeared to be a black woman. She didn't fit into any preconceived mold that people were comfortable with.
Like Prince?
She wasn't poor, she wasn't disadvantaged, she had dark skin, but she certainly wasn't an advantaged, wealthy white woman. Did Angela's race have anything to do with how the justice system treated her? As we talk through what happened in the trial, I want you to try to imagine a white 23-year-old woman with a daddy driving a Rolls Royce and think about whether or not you think the court system would have done anything differently. And remember, this fire occurred in 1999. In 1986, the fire department in this area was in court fighting against hiring black firefighters. Now, I'm not going to get into that case, but suffice it to say that there was openly blatant racial bias and racial stereotypes on display in the courtroom during that case, which occurred only 13 years before this fire. I'd like to think that racism didn't enter the halls of justice, but I ask you to keep that in mind as we go over the things the prosecutor said about Angela in court in a community that had been so racially divided in such recent history. In fact, in 2002, after this fire, there was yet another lawsuit brought forward alleging that Cleveland's black communities were still suffering from racism because the city was defunding and closing fire stations in black-populated areas as budgets were slashed. Cleveland was notoriously divided on issues of race, and the prosecution appeared to play on that when they presented their case in court, as this young black unwed mother was defending herself. But here's the thing. Angela Garcia may appear to be black, but she's Puerto Rican. And Angela's mother did her best to rally community support for Angela, and shockingly, some of the most supportive communities that came out to speak on Angela's behalf ended up being Amish communities that had worked with Angela's stepfather through his business. They absolutely loved him. And Angela's stepdad was adamant that his stepdaughter had not done this. He tried to hunt down identical candles because he was convinced that they were defective and had caused this fire. In a fit of desperation, he actually took Angela to the police station himself and asked for polygraph testing. And Angela took not one but 2 separate polygraph tests, which she passed. But because polygraph testing isn't admissible in court, the defense wasn't allowed to tell the jury that she had passed 2 polygraph tests. Al's intent here was to get the police to lay off his stepdaughter once she passed the polygraph test by proving that they were barking up the wrong tree. But at this point, the police had already made up their minds, and the results of these tests didn't matter. In February, Garcia's then-boyfriend woke her up because it was being reported on the news that Angela had been indicted in relation to the fire. Now, Angela reports that at the time, she didn't even know what that meant, so she called her mom and stepdad. And she went to their house, and that's where she was when detectives arrived to take her into custody. She later recalled in an interview, and all links to these interviews are in the show notes, that she didn't actually know what her charges were until she was processed into detention. She said there were other people being processed at the same time, and they were all being handed copies of their charging paperwork, and everyone was getting like a page or maybe 2 pages, but when they got to her, they handed her an entire package full of papers. And she didn't understand what any of it meant, but she saw words like attempted murder, insurance fraud, and aggravated arson. Prosecutors initially charged Angela with 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 3 counts of aggravated arson, and 1 count of insurance fraud. And you might be wondering, as I was, how she's being charged with 6 different murder counts and 3 different manslaughter counts. And the answer is that this is a tactic that the prosecution often uses. They'll throw every charge they think that they might have a chance of getting to stick, and then they'll drop charges as the trial approaches and the investigation refines the information and evidence that they have to reveal which charges are most appropriate. Or in this case, which charges are most appropriate based on the story that the investigators invented. Now, this case was assigned to the docket of Cuyahoga County Judge Bridget McCafferty. She was elected in 1999 with practically no experience and became absolutely notorious for having her decisions overturned in appeals. According to an amazing article by The Intercept in 2003, Cleveland Scene asked attorneys in the county to anonymously rate judges, and McCafferty won 2 dubious distinctions: most political and least intelligent. Attorneys actually told reporters that she had no clue what she was doing. And thanks to McCafferty's shortcomings in intelligence and knowledge of the law, the prosecution got away with murder, no pun intended. They even introduced new evidence at trial that hadn't been part of discovery, sending Angela's defense attorneys absolutely into orbit. One of her attorneys accused the state of conducting a, quote, trial by ambush, unquote, and I honestly can't disagree with that assessment. Angela Garcia sat in a courtroom accused of murdering her children and listened to the prosecutors tell a jury that she was a young, promiscuous woman, as evidenced by the fact that she had 2 children by 2 different fathers at the age of 22. They told jurors she had come up with a calculated plan to purchase life insurance and renter's insurance in the months before the fire, and a twisted plan to bail herself out of a bad financial situation. They also told the jury that she hadn't actually wanted to be a mom, and they could prove this because she had recently tried to get her sister to take custody of her girls. Ultimately, they said Angela Garcia had murdered her own children for money. But what evidence did they present besides the fire myths that we've already covered? Well, let's start with what they did not present. They did not present a theory of how Garcia started the fire. But they did have a fire investigator get on the stand and explain alligatoring and pool fires and holes in the floor and all of those things we already discussed. They talked about this sturdy candle holder and how there weren't any combustibles near where the candles were lit. Now remember, NFPA 921 was the standard by which investigators were supposed to evaluate this evidence. They were not supposed to develop a theory of the fire and then look at the evidence through that lens. They also weren't supposed to determine a cause for the fire by using negative corpus, which is where they say, well, we couldn't find proof of anything else, so it had to have been arson. Instead, they were supposed to look at the evidence and consider every theory of the fire from accidental to arson, and one by one determine if it could be excluded based on scientific evidence. If one of those theories was that it could have been arson caused by pouring accelerant on the floor and then lighting it, then they should have taken samples from the floor in the area of the fire and had them sent to a lab for testing, but they didn't do that. They did have an accelerant dog who did not alert in the area. So that should have ruled out this theory of the fire, and then they could move on to other theories such as the candles, electrical causes, lightning, whatever. And if they had followed the rules of 921, they could not have called this fire arson based on what they had done. They would have had to have classified it as either accidental or of unknown origin. But they sat up in court and told a jury bald-faced lies that the evidence they uncovered through photographs were absolute proof of an accelerant. And I can understand how Judge McCafferty might not have had a scientific grasp of why this testimony was problematic, but there were things she absolutely should have understood. And one of those things is something called the Daubert ruling. This comes from a 1993 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, which states that expert testimony has to be scientifically valid and relevant to the matter at hand, and the judge's role is to play gatekeeper for all of the tests of Daubert. And while this can be tricky to apply, McCafferty's decisions in this case appear to indicate that she doesn't even understand what Daubert is. That's not my theory. That came straight out of the Intercept article, which is amazing, and you can find it in the show notes. Daubert is intended to exclude expert testimony that isn't based on scientific evidence and isn't relevant to the case. The factors for Daubert that the judge is supposed to consider are whether the techniques have been tested, whether they've ever been peer-reviewed or published, whether it has a known potential error rate, whether it's generally accepted in the scientific community, and whether there are standards or controls in place. It's designed to keep junk science out of the courtroom because people presented as experts can greatly skew a jury's opinion of the case. So let's go over such witness testimony that McCafferty should have put a leash on under Daubert. One witness's name was Ralph Dolence, Dolence. And he was presented as an independent fire investigator and master electrician. Now, he testified that he had investigated some 15,000 fires.
Sounds like a lot.
Well, a fire investigator will typically investigate anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred fires a year, depending on complexity, where they are, and all kinds of different factors. But let's just pick apart this number for a second. If he investigated one fire every single day of the year, so 365 fires a year, assuming he took leap day off, it would take him 41 years to get to 15,000 fires. This guy's already lying, or he's deluded before we even get to his testimony.
Maybe he was counting like previous lives or something.
I don't think previous lives are admissible in court.
Not even in India?
That I don't know. I actually have never thought about this. I wonder if it's ever been brought up. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he meant to say 1,500 and he just misspoke. He had never been to the house. He just looked at photos. Yet he offered an expert opinion as an electrician and independent fire investigator, and I'm using quotes around fire investigator. But he testified in court as an expert saying Angela could not have possibly escaped through the second-story window like she said. He said it just wasn't possible. He offered no basis for this. McCafferty allowed it. Then he told the jury that he had confirmed with lab tests that the candles couldn't have started the fire through experimentation. He used a candle stand that he said was similar to the one in the photos, even though he could not have known the weight or dimensions of the candle stand from the photos. And he bought similar candles, which he then knocked off of this similar stand he had, and they were not able to light the carpet or wood in his lab on fire, so he concluded that this proved the fire had been intentionally set. That is a big leap from a candle would go out if it fell over to it has to be arson. You can't just say it's arson because you eliminate one other possible scenario. You have to find proof it was arson, and you have to rule out all the other possibilities. Now, Garcia's attorneys tried to challenge this testimony under Daubert, and it should not have been allowed because, yes, standards did exist that were relevant in the scientific community under NFPA 921, and none of this evidence follows any sort of technique or theories that have been tested or peer-reviewed by the scientific community. And given all of the possible variables that exist between how he did his testing and the actual conditions in the fire, it would have been so easy to exclude this testimony, but McCafferty didn't. The prosecution also brought in firefighters and EMTs that told the jury that the girls were at a window when they found them, and one of them had been tied up by the cord from the blinds to keep her from escaping, when in fact, She had been tangled up into the blinds. She was trying to get to the window when she lost consciousness, and the blinds had melted down over her. So firefighters had just ripped the blinds off the window when they removed the child from the fire, which probably resulted in her becoming entangled in the cords. The prosecutors paraded witnesses across the stand that would all say that Angela's behavior seemed inappropriate for a mom that lost her kids in a fire. Some of these were the same witnesses that had told reporters immediately after the fire that Garcia was hysterical on scene. But now they testified that Garcia was not acting right, she was not dirty or bleeding the night of the fire, making the jury believe that there's no way she could have been inside the house when the smoke was that thick as she claimed, and she couldn't have bailed out a second-story window. However, initially after the fire, the neighbor's door that she had banged on to get help was stained with her blood and with soot from Garcia. But now they were saying, no, she was pristine. One witness even said that she had seen Garcia bail out the front door of her home and not out her bedroom window. Then the insurance agent and investigators testified about her insurance claims. They said she had returned her insurance claims forms too fast, really fast, unusually fast for somebody that had been through what she'd gone through. But there's actually a good reason for this. Angela's stepfather's business, it specialized in rehabilitating structures that had been damaged by fire. Angela had worked there, and her job was detailing fire losses on insurance paperwork. She had worked in a job where she filled out these types of claim forms all the time. It was routine for her. And maybe she did overvalue or even flat out lie on her insurance claim paperwork, but that doesn't make her guilty of murder. That just makes her guilty of insurance fraud. And if we look at the suspicious timing of the purchasing of the policies, we need to note that Angela actually hadn't even wanted to purchase the policies. Her sister had purchased coverage and insisted that Angela do the same. And then insurance salesmen showed up at her work to try to sell her a policy, and she reluctantly purchased one. After all, her stepdad's business was fire recovery, and she understood how important it was to have insurance. Instead of being a reasonable explanation for why Angela had returned the forms so fast, and instead the community seemed to now insinuate that obviously Angela's stepdad's business has to be involved in fraud, and that's why he was able to drive a Rolls Royce and give his wife a mink coat. The entire family was clearly just money-hungry shysters in the court of public opinion, and they were all presumed to be in on the plot. In fact, that first jury had no problem finding Angela guilty of insurance fraud. Easy decision, in fact. But the jury argued for 5 days over whether she was guilty of setting the fire and killing her baby girls. And it was one middle-aged black juror from Cleveland's East Side that prevented her from being convicted in that ambush of a trial. In the question of whether Angela was capable of hurting her children for financial gain, one big problem was that the state couldn't prove or couldn't find anyone to say that Angela didn't love her girls and didn't want them. She was a doting mother. In fact, the night of the fire, Angela had been on the phone earlier with a pediatrician because she was concerned about her youngest daughter's breathing because she had been a preemie and had frequent respiratory infections and was currently suffering from one. What mom calls the pediatrician right before she murders her children? But this one juror saw a photo of the girls and noted something that none of the white jurors likely would have realized. Naima and Nija had their hair done with dozens of red and blue beads carefully woven into their hair. And this woman knew that to do hair like that took hours of time and patience. And this was not something a mother does for a baby she considers to be a burden or she doesn't want. She believed that mother loved her babies, and she struggled to help her white peers in the jury room understand this. She later told the press that the white jurors in the room, they didn't even understand what security gates were. These were a common fixture in the kinds of low-income neighborhoods where Angela had lived, but these jurors were baffled at the concept. And the black jurors in the room were more skeptical of the firefighters and cops that testified, while the white jurors seemed to exhibit zero skepticism of their testimony. After 5 days of juror deliberations, and more than once it dissolved into screaming battles that were so loud they could be heard outside the jury room, the jury told the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked on the issue of murder. Angela was found guilty of insurance fraud, but on the charges against her for the deaths of her daughters, a mistrial was declared. But that would be far from the end of the issues for Angela and her family that continued to support her through her trial. Prosecutors weren't willing to give up here. So you're going to have to join us next week as we get into the retrial for Angela Garcia on Crime to Burn. Can I get a little zoom so I can read this page?
I've been watching you all for eons, and I find you of interest.
Ooh, my chair just made a noise.
How unfortunate.
It was an unfortunate noise.
Sounds like you should be more comfortable now.
It wasn't me, it was the chair.
I don't think there is a comfortable position.
Is that like an official size? I don't know.
I don't know. It says size matters right on them, so.
It sure does.
Entropy consumes all, as does sour cream.
I've lost track of time and space and the size of my ass.
Oh, dear. The Star-Lords wage war over the last ember of the dying sun, but sure, let's talk about some guy who torched a Wendy's. Are there cheeseburgers? I'm already disappointed with your story. Well, that's because every time I go there afterwards, shortly thereafter, I enroll myself into a 12-step cheeseburger program, and that's about how long it takes me to get to the 13th step.
Which is reintroduce the toxin.
Relapse. Yeehaw.
It looks all intimidating over there now. I don't know what to do with any of that equipment. The only one I'm really comfortable with is the, what am I not supposed to call it? The slapper.
I'd love it if you'd take over that duty.
You mean take over your duty?
Not now.
Not if you're going to put it like that.
Change my mind now.
This is alcoholic? Hey, what are we going to do with all that ginger?
I don't know. I don't think ginger's good for vampires, is it?
That's garlic.
Asian vampires? I mean, what's worse than a regular vampire? Some vampire that's doing some Jackie Chan on you.
That is terrifying to think about. I don't know. Do all vampires have a widow's peak?
You have a computer.
Oh, I have a computer. I forgot all about that.
Holy ass. It's like the Mandela effect. I remember widow's peaks, but they might not be there.
Neither he nor Brad Pitt had a widow's peak.
You have to earn the widow's peak. You don't just have that assigned to you. Now, there is an exception. Eddie Munster was born with the widow's peak. Revolutionary young vampire. Just born with great vampire genetics.
This is a deep hole of the internet I could spend way too long in.
Well, that has everything in common with every other deep hole on the internet.
No, some of the deep holes have benefits, I was about to say. You know, like you learn things sometimes.
Sometimes it's not what you take away from a deep hole, it's what you leave behind.
Why are your pants dusty?
You got dusty britches.
You've been rolling around on the floor or something?
No, I live with you and your animals, and you all shed this material upon me. What yoga mat isn't portable? Knees getting skint from boofing demons? Strange metaphysical activities on the go.
And I was like, I don't know how not to be too awkward. I'm shocked at how long I went in my life without realizing how awkward I was.
You know what would really make this more compelling? Little hearts that float around their butts.
No, if you look at the rear end of a corgi.
I don't spend that much time looking up the back end of dogs.
Let's destroy the algorithm. They all do have floofy pants, though. Of their peers, it's a... I'm on a roll.
You're on a horse.
Okay.
The horse just got electrocuted. You're such a child. You're such a child. This story's already taken your breath away.
More than some old wives' tales that sauntered into the court disguised as science. What's wrong with that?
Nothing. I'm a visual thinker, and so I was imagining these disembodied tales.
You can hear it wherever you go. You can hear it.
Oh man, your mouth just fell down the stairs.
In this case, it is so important to share it in order to.
Hey. If you get that top lip out too far in front of the bottom lip, you just go head over heels and you start rolling. Candles. They'll burn your anus if you sit on them.
Don't sit on them. Ever. Especially if you have had beans.
This episode was brought to you by beans.
It meant that the fire had grown.
Black is your heart.
Unkink yourself, my friend. My kinky friend. Angela Garcia sat in a courtroom accused of murdering her children. Angela Garcia... Okay, loosen up. I can't read my own writing that I typed.
Meat potatoes taste like meat if meat was a potato.
Well, that seems like a good thought to end with.
This Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2025, You Should Be Here, a podcast series by Fire Eyes Media, was released titled Or No. After the well-known concept, Do You Love Me? Check yes or no. And in this season of You Should Be Here, a group of true crime podcasters team up to share stories and advocate for victims and survivors of domestic abuse and domestic violence. Love shouldn't hurt. Love shouldn't harm you. And with every listen, with every download of Or No, you are helping give back to individuals who have suffered in an unloving and abusive relationship. You are helping raise money in this 100% Podcasters Give Back collaboration to give back to nonprofits which are standing against domestic violence. If you or someone you love is a victim of domestic abuse, we beg of you to call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. The person on the end of the line will be able to provide resources and provide help because we want you safe, we want you unharmed, and we want you to know you deserve a love that is happy and healthy and never harmful, and that you should be here. This collaborative podcast was brought together by Fire Eyes Media, and Jen and Jules both bring episodes in this series as well. But I want to take the time to shout out the others who helped work on Or No and donated their time, their research, their efforts to help this very important cause. John and Jamie, the hosts of True Crime Cast. Holly, the host of Crime with Holly. Alicia, one half of Twisted and Uncorked, and the host of the upcoming podcast, Truly Twisted. Rachel and Heather, the hosts of Like Mother, Like Murder. Leah D., the host of Least of These. Kim, the host of A Million Other Choices. Kayla, the host of Tragedy with a View. April, the host of Crime to Burn. Jen, the host of Case Uncovered and one half of True Crime in Headlines. And of course, Jules, one part of True Crime in Headlines and the host of Chart Topper Missing in Hushtown. Behind the scenes is important, or I should say behind the headphones or behind the mic. But what is the most important? What really matters is who we all showed up for, who we all took the time to raise awareness for, be a voice for the voiceless, and bring these cases forward to help push the story of Evilise Lugo, whose case is open and the prime suspect is on the run. Francine Wilson, whose story shaped history when it comes to battered women's syndrome. And so many more who ultimately deserve to be remembered for who they were before this loveless tragedy took place. Please go to You Should Be Here and subscribe to get the full season of Or No, which is available right now for free wherever you get your podcasts. The Homicide Tree was season 1 of You Should Be Here, so if you haven't yet checked that out, it is waiting for you as well. All of those episodes are on loved ones who would not be home for the holidays, and was also a Podcasters Give Back collaboration where all proceeds went directly back to helping families through the nonprofit Shores of Strength. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to listen and to help those in need. And remember, you're wanted, you're needed, and you deserve a safe love.